It's one of the world's most long-lasting and dreadful conflicts. But how did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict start, and what does the future hold? Recent weeks have seen a rapid increase in fighting between Israeli and Palestinian militants, with attacks from both sides. The long-running tensions began to flare up again in April during the holy Muslim month of Ramadan. In the first week nearly 200 people, many of them were children, were killed in Gaza. Israeli authorities reported a dozen people, including 2 children, dead in Israel. In this video we are aiming to summarize the entire chronology of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Since the end of the Second World War, the harsh struggle between Israelis and Palestinians have led to devastating, and deeply complex conflicts. Mainly, it's a fight about territory. The roots of the conflict go back to biblical times, but from a modern historical perspective, the late 1800s and early 1900s were central to the situation that exists now. During the First World War, the United Kingdom helped the Arabs to fight against the Ottoman Empire, promising that they will have a state all to themselves after the war is over. This was a lie. After the war, the United Kingdom shared the Arab territories with France. Among the territories there was Palestine, which was under British control. The Arabs were far from winning after the war. They still wanted an Arab state independent of the Ottoman Empire. However, instead, they were colonized by the English and the French. And in addition, one of their territories, Palestine, would be reserved for the creation of a Jewish state. This was named the Balfour Declaration. This meant that the Arabs in this region were concerned about their future, which subsequently led to many Arab riots in the 1920s and 1930s in Palestine. After the Great Arab Revolt of 1936, the United Kingdom decided to stop Jewish immigration to Palestine. In the meantime, the Jews were in a very unfavorable situation in Europe as anti-Semitism was considerably increasing, and the Jews were forced to leave. It is estimated that between 40,000 to 50,000 Jews came to Palestine between 1880 and the First World War, and 350,000 came between the First World War and the Second. It is difficult to understand how the Jewish population evolved, but it can be said that it represented a third of the population of Palestine following the events of World War II. As time went on, the UK realized that the situation was much more complicated than expected. The situation was that there were a lot of Jews who had arrived and they had to create a state for them. For this, there were several solutions. The Arabs wanted to have an Arab state, where the Jews were a protected minority. The Jews, on the other hand, preferred to have a Jewish state where the Jews could live without any international problems. There were a lot of Jews in Europe who wanted to come. Following the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolts in Palestine, the UK released a third white paper, which provided a territory to the advantage of the Arabs. However, following challenges from the Zionists, the plan was revised by the UN, which proposed borders for the Jewish and the Arab states respectively. Different countries had to vote for or against, and a majority voted in favor. Arab countries voted against. Once the plan was declared official, the Civil War of 1947 to 1948 began. For the purpose of mandating Palestine, on May 14, 1948, the Jewish state was declared and the Civil War turned into a war against the Arab League, which became known as the Israeli-Arab War of 1948 to 1949. As a result of this war, Israel gained and shared territories with neighboring countries. Transjordan took part of the West Bank, Egypt takes the Gaza Strip, and Israel takes all the other Palestinian Arab territories, with an estimated 700,000 Palestinians having to leave their territories. Israel had waged 4 wars against Arab countries. The first is the aforementioned 1948 to 1949 Israeli-Arab War. Israel won this war and allowed 700,000 Jews to come, a minority of whom were from Arab countries. The second was the Suez Crisis in 1956, where Israel won against Egypt by taking the Sinai, which led to them having to withdraw following international pressure. 250,000 Jews from Arab countries come to Israel as a result of the war. The third is the Six-Day War, where Israel attacked and won against Egypt and Jordan, taking Gaza and Sinai from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The fourth is the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where Israel is attacked by Egypt and Syria without success. Israel wins again. Arab oil countries decide to create an oil embargo on all countries that support Israel. In addition to these wars, there are growing tensions between Palestinians and Israelis. First there are the Fedayeen Palestinians, who led attacks and revolts in the 1950s and 1960s. Then there is the Palestine Liberation Organization known as PLO, which was created in 1964 and whose armed wing carried out attacks on Israeli soil. In addition, there were other attacks from other Palestinian groups, in Israel and abroad, from organized groups. In 1972, for example, there was an attack on Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games in Munich. However, among the most famous attacks was the 1978 Coastal Road Massacre, perpetrated against a bus in Israel by a branch of the PLO. The massacre had 39 dead without counting the terrorists. In response to the attacks, Israel carried out attacks against Lebanon, where the PLO is organizing. Israel subsequently participated in a fifth war in the region, the Lebanon War. Israel, although powerful militarily, found itself with great tensions, including regular terrorist attacks. Therefore, they had to initiate peace processes. The first peace treaty was signed with Egypt in 1978, called the Camp David Accords, in which it was agreed that Israel returns Sinai to Egypt but keeps Gaza. Afterward, the Jewish colony created in Sinai moved. The inhabitants, who were there, were displaced and compensated. In 1987, violent riots resumed. It is the first Intifada, which lasted until 1993. The PLO, which is in full discussion with Israel, proposes the creation of a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state in 1988. At the same time, it is Hamas that appears, which was very different from the PLO. Hamas is an Islamist organization. In 1993, Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords, and a Palestinian Authority is created within Israel. Two territories are under the direction of this authority: Gaza on one side, populated by Palestinians, and the West Bank on the other. The problem was that in the West Bank, lots of Israeli settlements had been created, and so, the peace process will find it difficult to move forward. Since the Oslo Accords between 1993 and 1995, the peace process has been nothing but a series of failures. The Israeli Prime Minister was killed in 1995, by a Zionist extremist. At the same time, a new wave of migration arrives from the former Soviet Union. 1 million Jews from Russia arrive in Israel. From 2000, the Second Intifada begins, consisting of a series of revolts accompanied by terrorist attacks on Israeli territory. Conservative governments are carrying out more and more attacks to fight terrorism, which aggravates the explosive situation. From 2001, Hamas began to launch rockets from Gaza, which was continued to be done regularly, and it is especially the two neighboring towns of Ashkelon and Sderot that would be targeted. In 2005, Gaza was completely decolonized by the Israelis, and the following year Hamas took power in the elections. Israel was now left with two problems: Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza is being occupied by the Islamists. Israel and Egypt decide to blockade the territory in 2007. In 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu came to power for the second time. He must make alliances with the extreme right, and will lead a policy of colonization in the West Bank. Tensions are increasing, although they do not always affect the daily lives of Israelis. We can note several important events. First, the August 2011 confrontation near the Gaza Strip, where civilians are killed on both sides with missiles and bombardments. The 2012 confrontation over several months still in Gaza. A few Israelis are killed in attacks, and 100 Palestinians in Israeli reprisals. It is followed by a war on the territory of Gaza, where Israel intervenes for a month. In 2014, the Second Gaza War took place, which left around 2,000 Palestinians dead. There were also some Israeli deaths. Between 2015 and 2016, there is a series of violent attacks during the period. Since many attacks are carried out with a knife, we are talking about the knife intifada, but it lasts for a short time. At the same time, there is rocket fire and aerial bombardment. In 2018, there is the Great March of Return, which is a phase of violence with bombardments once again. In recent news, this crisis is part of the same past conflict taking place for decades. There is rocket fire coming from Gaza which causes some deaths on the Israeli side, and Israel responds by bombing Gaza and killing more. To make a very brief recap of the situation in Israel today, there is Gaza, which is populated by Palestinians and is self-governing. But there has been a blockade led by Israel and Egypt since 2007. Hamas rules the territory and is considered an Islamist terrorist organization. They are funded by Iran and regularly launch rockets at Israel. In return, Israel regularly bombs Gaza since there are no more settlers in the territory. On the other side, there is the West Bank, which is officially Palestinian but which is practically all occupied by Israel. Conservative governments encourage Israelis to settle there, often the poorest, because housing is cheaper. I will not go into more details, because this video is mainly intended to summarize the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This crisis is not yet over. I often talk about geopolitics, so if you're interested, Don't hesitate to subscribe to my channel, where I talk about other subjects that I don't have time to cover on video. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for the latest news.